Welcome back, deep divers. Today we're going to take a deep dive into, a pretty provocative book. It's called Resistance is Futile: How the Trump-Hating Left Lost Its Collective Mind. It's by Coulter.
Yeah, that title certainly doesn't pull any punches, does it?
No, it does not. And, just to give everyone a little context before we jump in, the book's core argument is that essentially the American left just went completely bonkers after Trump's election.
Right.
Coulter argues they were engaging in these over-the-top reactions and just totally illogical arguments.
Right, right. And she uses this kind of sharp satirical tone throughout the book to really hammer home her points.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we're going to be working directly with excerpts from the book itself.
So get ready for some fiery rhetoric and some pretty strong opinions.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Now, before we get too deep into the arguments themselves, maybe you can give us a little background on Coulter. For those who maybe aren't familiar with her work, how would you describe her place in the world of political commentary?
Well, Coulter's been a pretty prominent voice on the conservative side of American politics for like decades now. You know, she's known for her sharp wit, her very uncompromising views. And honestly, she kind of has a knack for stirring up controversy.
She definitely does not shy away from a fight.
No, not at all. She's written a ton of best-selling books. She's a frequent commentator on TV. And just lover or hater, she's a force to be reckoned with.
So to sum it up, we've got this very outspoken, fiery, conservative commentator taking on, what she sees as the excesses of the left during those Trump years. Now, what's the main, thread that she's trying to weave throughout Resistance is Futile?
Well, her central argument is that the left's opposition to Trump went way beyond just, typical political disagreements. She's arguing that they were basically driven by this, like, blind hatred, that it clouded their judgment and led them to embrace these illogical arguments, and to engage in these just, like, totally over-the-top reactions.
So she's saying it wasn't just we disagree with his policies. It was something much deeper and more irrational in her view.
Yeah, exactly. She essentially paints this picture of a left that just, like, completely lost its mind when faced with Trump's victory.
And to make her case, she uses all sorts of specific examples, starting right off the bat in that first chapter, with a pretty dramatic comparison. I mean, she's comparing the left's reaction to Trump to, like, the fear and hysteria surrounding figures like Hitler and Stalin.
Yeah, and right there you see her using this, pretty classic Coulter tactic,
Right.
hyperbole.
To really drive home her point.
Exactly. By comparing the left's response to these, totalitarian figures, she's not actually saying Trump-eyes Hitler or anything like that. It's more about highlighting what she sees as just the utter irrationality of their reaction.
It's like she's trying to shock the reader into, questioning the basis of their own fears about Trump.
Exactly. To get them to step back and say, okay, is this really like Hitler?
And she doesn't just stick with these broad comparisons. Coulter actually digs into Trump's personality, and she points out what she sees as this glaring contradiction. Like, she highlights his tendency to actually heap praise on people, even those who are, like, typically seen as his political enemies.
Right. Like when he was saying all those surprisingly nice things about Kim Jong-un.
Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea.
Yep. Trump called him, let me see, a funny guy, very smart, and a great negotiator.
Which, let's be honest, is not exactly the language you'd expect someone to use when they're talking about, a dictator they're supposedly facing off against.
Not at all. So she's basically saying the left's portrayal of Trump as this, tyrannical authoritarian figure doesn't line up with how he actually behaves.
Okay, so we've got this core argument about the left's overreaction, and she's using this almost contradictory aspect of Trump's personality to poke holes in their narrative. So where does she go from there?
Well, in the next section, she dives into what she calls the resistance. It's basically this, like, multi-pronged institutional pushback against Trump.
Okay, so not just individuals, but like whole institutions.
Exactly. She gives examples from the courts, from colleges, the media, even the world of sports, all seemingly united in their opposition to Trump.
So she's painting this picture of a very widespread, very coordinated effort to undermine his entire agenda.
Exactly. And it all ties back to her book's title, Resistance is Futile. Coulter's suggesting that no matter how hard they push back, no matter what they do, they just won't be able to stop Trump and his supporters.
It's almost like she's saying, give it up, guys. You're fighting a losing battle.
Yeah, there's definitely that element to it. And then, to really drive this point home, she uses a very specific example, Hillary Clinton's declaration after the election that she was part of the resistance.
That's interesting. It's not typical for a losing candidate to, use that kind of language, is it?
Not really. Usually they concede gracefully and, even if they stay politically active, they don't usually frame themselves as part of a active resistance movement.
So by using that term, Clinton was signaling a break from that norm.
Exactly. And for Coulter, that moment becomes symbolic of the left's refusal to, accept the election results and their determination to undermine Trump no matter what.
So we see this theme of refusal to accept the outcome. And then to kind of build on her point about the left's hypocrisy, Coulter brings in a legal concept, the supremacy clause.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Now, for those of us who maybe slept through that part of civics class, can you give us a quick refresher on what the supremacy clause is?
Sure. Basically, it says that federal law is the top dog. It takes precedence over state law when there's a conflict. It's, one of the fundamental principles of our whole federal system, meant to make sure we have a consistent legal framework across the entire country.
Okay, so how does this tie into Coulter's argument about hypocrisy on the left?
Well, she points to what she sees as their totally contradictory stances on the supremacy clause. It all depends on who's in the White House, apparently.
So how did that play out during the Obama and Trump years?
She argues that when Obama was president, the left was all about the supremacy clause, especially when he basically chose to ignore federal immigration law in favor of policies that they supported.
But then, when Trump did similar things, ignoring federal law in ways that benefited his agenda, the left suddenly became staunch opponents of the very same clause they had defended before.
Exactly. It's like the clause itself didn't matter. It was all about who was using it and for what purpose.
So for Coulter, this is a clear example of the left applying a double standard, supporting a legal principle when it helps their side, but opposing it when it benefits their opponents.
Yep. And in her view, this just proves that their real motivation is just bias against Trump. It overrides any actual commitment to consistency or fairness.
So we see this perceived hypocrisy in the legal realm, but Coulter argues that it's happening in a more cultural sense too, especially when it comes to humor.
Right, right. In her chapter called, get ready for this title, Bald-Faced Lie Number 2, she basically says that the left has completely lost its sense of humor, especially when it comes to anything remotely related to Trump.
And she uses a specific example to illustrate this point, right?
Yeah, she brings up a joke that John McCain made during the 2008 campaign.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
He was speaking at a motorcycle rally and made a joke about his wife maybe participating in a biker beauty pageant.
Now, whether or not you find that funny, it was clearly intended as a joke.
Right. But Coulter says the left took it totally seriously, accusing McCain of sexism and being insensitive.
So for her, this becomes an example of this larger trend where the left just overreacts to anything that could be seen as offensive, even if it was just a lighthearted joke.
Exactly. It's this hypersensitivity, this constant outrage that she sees as a symptom of something much deeper. The left's inability to, engage with Trump and his supporters in a genuine way.
Like they're so caught up in their opposition that they've lost the ability to see things objectively, even humor.
Right. It's all just part of this, this big, bad, Trump-hating narrative that she's building.
And of course, she goes on to address one of the most serious accusations leveled at Trump, racism. In her chapter, Trump is a Racist, we've scientifically proved it. She kind of mocks the media's attempts to use data to prove that he's racist.
Yeah, she's basically saying that they already have their conclusion that Trump is racist, and then they just cherry pick data to fit that narrative.
Instead of letting the data lead them to a conclusion, they're starting with the conclusion and then working backward.
Exactly. And she points out how dangerous that approach can be.
Yeah.
When you're using data just to confirm what you already believe, you're not really analyzing anything, honestly.
You're just reinforcing your own biases. Which brings us to one of the most let's just say controversial moments of Trump's presidency. The Charlottesville rally. How does Coulter handle that in Resistance is Futile?
Well, she analyzes how that rally was used to, label Trump racist, and how, in her view, he was very unfairly criticized for his response, specifically when he condemned the violence on both sides.
Right, that statement caused a huge e-backlash.
It did, but it's important to remember that this rally involved all these different groups with all sorts of different ideologies and motivations.
Yeah, it was a very complex situation.
It was, and while everyone, condemned the violence that happened, there were very different interpretations of who was responsible and how Trump should have responded.
And Coulter argues that, given how complex it was, Trump's condemnation of both sides was actually pretty reasonable.
Yeah, she thinks he was unfairly singled out and labeled a racist for not specifically denouncing the white supremacists, even though, in her view, there's no actual evidence that he agrees with their views.
This section really shows how Coulter uses this book to present like an alternative narrative to how the media covered Trump.
Yeah, she's trying to reframe those events, to challenge that accepted narrative that Trump is a racist and a white supremacist sympathizer.
Okay, so from Charlottesville, she shifts gears to talk about the left's focus on Russian collusion during the 2016 election. How does she approach that?
Well, in her chapter titled, Now They Want to Fight the Cold War, she argues that the left's obsession with Russian meddling is nothing more than a modern-day Red Scare.
Ah, the Red Scare. Yeah. For those who might not be familiar with that term, can you explain what it refers to?
Sure. Basically, it refers to these periods in American history when there was this intense, anti-communist paranoia. It happened especially after World War I and during the Cold War. And during those times, there was just this widespread fear that communists were infiltrating and subverting everything.
So it often led to government overreach and people being persecuted for their political beliefs.
Yeah.
Okay, so by comparing the left's focus on Russian collusion to the Red Scare, Coulter is basically saying it's driven by the same kind of, irrational fear and paranoia.
Exactly. She's saying that the left couldn't accept Trump's victory, so they latched on to this idea of Russian interference as a way to, delegitimize his presidency and undermine anyone who supported him.
It's interesting how she connects this seemingly contemporary issue back to these recurring themes in American history.
Yeah, it's a tactic she uses throughout the book. She draws these parallels between what's happening now and those historical precedents. It helps her make her argument that, the left behavior is part of this much larger pattern.
Okay, so we've got the Red Scare comparison. Who does she target next in her critique of the left?
Well, she takes aim at George Soros, the billionaire philanthropist who's been a favorite target of right-wing criticism for a long time.
Soros is a pretty complex and controversial figure, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. He's been praised for his philanthropy and demonized for his political activism. It really depends who you ask.
Right. So how does Coulter portray him?
Well, she focuses on his involvement in Eastern European politics. Specifically, she criticizes his efforts to, influence elections in former Soviet republics. She accuses him of using his wealth and influence to basically install governments that align with his own political views.
Okay, and of course, foreign interference in elections is a very real and legitimate concern.
It is. But Coulter uses Soros as an example to highlight what she sees as, yet another example of hypocrisy on the left.
Because they're outraged by the alleged Russian interference, but seem to ignore Soros's alleged meddling in other countries?
Exactly. She's drawing a parallel between the two, suggesting they're both examples of powerful people trying to manipulate elections for their own gain.
Okay, so we've got this recurring theme of hypocrisy and double standards. Where does Coulter go next in her critique of the left's reaction to Trump?
She turns her attention to the intelligence community. Specifically, she looks at how the media covered their findings on Russian interference in the 2016 election.
This is where things start to get really interesting, because she's diving into some of those more intricate, more controversial aspects of the whole Trump-Russia saga.
Exactly. In her chapter titled Intelligence Agencies, You Tell Her We Can't Game the Electoral College, she tackles that claim that all 17 U.S. intelligence agencies agreed that Russia interfered in the election.
Now, that was a very widely reported claim at the time.
It was. But Coulter says that it was a deliberate misrepresentation. She argues that the media intentionally, inflated the level of consensus to make it seem like there was absolutely no doubt about Russian interference, all to further damage Trump's reputation.
So she's accusing the media of basically manipulating information to fit a predetermined narrative.
Exactly. And then she goes on to express her skepticism about that January 6th, 2017 intelligence report on Russian interference. She points out its lack of concrete evidence and its heavy reliance on anonymous sources.
Now, evaluating intelligence reports can be incredibly complex. There's always that tension between transparency and the need to protect sources and methods.
Right. And Coulter uses the inherent complexity to basically cast doubt on the report's credibility. She suggests that it was, at least in part, politically motivated.
It's a perspective that definitely resonates with those who already believe that the intelligence community was biased against Trump.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And from there, she dives into the role of James Comey, the former FBI director who was fired by Trump in the middle of the whole Russia investigation.
Yeah, Comey's firing was a major turning point in that whole saga.
It really was. And it raised all those questions about potential obstruction of justice. It fueled speculation about Trump's relationship with Russia.
So what's Coulter's take on all that?
She argues that Comey deliberately misled Congress about the Trump investigation, specifically to make it seem like Trump fired him to obstruct justice.
So in her view, Comey was kind of orchestrating his own firing to make Trump look guilty and push that narrative of collusion.
Exactly. And this all feeds into her larger argument that the intelligence community, the so-called deep state, was actively working against Trump, using their power to undermine him.
And then she goes even further, right? She compares the whole Clinton impeachment to the allegations against Trump.
Right. She argues that liberals are using a total double standard. Clinton was impeached for actual crimes.
Well, he was impeached by the House.
Right. Impeached by the House, but not convicted by the Senate. And she argues that Trump hasn't actually committed any crimes.
Okay, but it's important to remember that the circumstances around Clinton's impeachment and the allegations against Trump were pretty different, legally and politically.
Oh, for sure. But Coulter's point is that the left is holding Trump to a completely different standard than they held Clinton.
It all comes back to that idea of partisan bias.
Exactly.
Which brings us to Robert Mueller, the special counsel appointed to investigate that Russian interference. How does she handle Mueller in Resistance is Futile?
Well, she doesn't hold back her skepticism, that's for sure. She criticizes what she sees as a lack of any real evidence of collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. And she also points to Mueller's history of what she calls questionable prosecutorial conduct.
Now, it's important to remember that a special counsel is supposed to be independent, free from political influence.
Right, of course. But Coulter argues that Mueller's investigation was basically driven by this one goal: to take down Trump no matter what.
And as evidence of potential bias, she points to the political affiliations of some of the people on Mueller's team, like their donations to Democratic candidates.
And even if it didn't actually affect the outcome of the investigation, that appearance of bias can definitely erode public trust.
Oh, for sure. But it's also important to avoid jumping to conclusions about someone's motivations just based on who they've donated to.
Absolutely. It's a very nuanced issue.
And it shows how difficult it is to conduct an investigation that's seen as fair and impartial, especially in such a politically polarized environment.
Yeah, that's the challenge.
Now, Coulter doesn't just criticize Mueller's whole investigation. She goes after some very specific aspects of it, like the controversies surrounding that Steele dossier.
Oh, yeah, that dossier. For anyone who needs a reminder, it was that collection of, let's just say, salacious and totally unverified allegations about Trump and his ties to Russia.
And it really played a big role in shaping the whole narrative around the Russia investigation.
Oh, it did. And Coulter argues that initially the media just took the dossier as fact, even though it was full of these wild, unverified claims.
And she says that their willingness to just embrace this document, despite its shady origins and lack of corroboration, reveals their bias against Trump.
Yeah, like they were so eager to push any story that made him look bad, even if it wasn't true.
So for Coulter, that dossier represents just how reckless the media was, how complicit they were in this whole effort to delegitimize Trump.
Exactly. And then she goes on to talk about Mueller's indictment of all those Russian individuals and entities, for interfering in the election through social media.
Right. Those are the first concrete charges related to election interference.
Right. But Coulter just dismisses it all as a distraction. She says the Russians' efforts were ultimately pretty insignificant.
Meaning they didn't actually affect the election results.
Right, and she sees that whole focus on Russian social media activity as just another way to try to, delegitimize Trump's victory.
So for her, it's just a continuation of the resistance.
Yeah.
This ongoing attempt to remove him from office, one way or another.
Yeah, pretty much.
And she doesn't shy away from naming names, right? She calls out the intelligence community, accusing them of leaking classified information, exaggerating the Russian threat, basically working to sabotage Trump's agenda.
Right. She really sees them as this deeply politicized force that's biased against Trump.
And, she doesn't stop there. She goes after the FBI, too, accusing them of engaging in these politically motivated investigations and abusing their power to target Trump and his people.
Yeah, she brings up the raid on Michael Cohen's office as a prime example of that alleged abuse of power.
Cohen, for those who might not remember, was Trump's personal lawyer. And he ended up getting caught up in that Russia investigation.
Right. He pleaded guilty to a bunch of charges.
And Coulter basically portrays the raid on Cohen's office as this vindictive act, like a fishing expedition to find anything they could use against Trump.
Yeah, she sees it as another example of how the deep state will weaponize law enforcement for political purposes.
Which brings us to one of the most, let's just say, explosive arguments in Resistance is Futile. Her call for the destruction of the mainstream media.
Wow, yeah. That's a pretty extreme statement.
It is. But she argues that the media has become so biased, so dishonest, and so corrupted that it's actually a danger to American society.
She basically sees them as the enemy of the people.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
She argues that the media's obsession with Trump, all the negative coverage, the leaks, the rumors, it's all contributed to this toxic political climate and eroded public trust in institutions.
So she's saying they've abandoned their traditional role as a watchdog.
Exactly.
Right.
Instead of holding those in power accountable, she believes they've become a propaganda machine.
And that their bias is so bad that it's actually threatening democracy itself.
Right. Now, obviously, this is an incredibly controversial argument, and a lot of people, even those who are critical of the media, push back against it.
Oh, for sure. It's definitely not a mainstream view.
But it shows just how deep the distrust of the media runs, especially among those on the right who feel like their voices aren't being heard, that their values are under attack, and that the media is part of the problem.
And Resistance is Futile is almost a battle cry for those people.
A rallying cry for those who feel like they're being silenced.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've looked at her criticisms of the left, her views on the media, her take on the deep state. But, of course, this is just a small taste of what Coulter has to offer in this very provocative, very controversial book.
It's definitely a wild ride.
It is. And we'll be back.
Thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please help support our channel by clicking the like and subscribe button. Thank you.
So buckle up, deep divers. We're going even deeper into the world of Ann Coulter, and Resistance is Futile.
Yeah, she definitely doesn't hold back.
Yeah.
Now, last time we were talking about those pretty explosive arguments she makes about the Russia investigation, the intelligence community, the media. Where do we pick up from there?
Well, next she takes on the FBI's handling of the investigation into Hillary Clinton's use of a private email server when she was Secretary of State.
Oh, yeah, that was a huge story during the 2016 election.
It was a big one, and honestly, it still causes a lot of debate.
It does. So how does Coulter frame this issue in Resistance is Futile?
Well, in her chapter, it's called A Tale of Two Dicks, she actually compares how the FBI handled the Clinton email investigation to the Watergate scandal.
Wow, that's a pretty bold comparison.
It is bold, but Coulter's point is that the FBI had, a double standard. They went easy on Clinton, but they were very aggressive in going after Trump and all his associates.
So she's saying the FBI, under Comey, was biased in favor of Clinton.
Yeah. And that they mishandled the whole investigation on purpose to keep her from facing charges.
And to make her case, she points to, inconsistencies in their investigation.
Exactly. Things that suggest they were more interested in protecting Clinton than finding the truth.
Which, again, all plays into her larger narrative about this deep state that's working against Trump.
Right. For Coulter, this Clinton email thing is proof that these powerful institutions can, rig the system to protect their own.
Okay, so we've talked about how controversial this book is.
Mm-hmm.
But what are some of the specific criticisms and praise it's received?
Well, on the one hand, critics say that Coulter is cherry-picking evidence, distorting facts, using really inflammatory language.
They say she's not being fair or accurate in her portrayal of the left.
Right. And that her style is more about, getting a rise out of people than having a real discussion.
Provocation over thoughtful debate.
Right. But then her supporters say that she's brave for speaking her mind, that she's smart and challenging.
They see her as this important voice that's needed to counter the liberal media.
Exactly. And they say she's a good researcher, that she can connect all these different pieces of information into a compelling story.
Even if it's a controversial one.
Yes, even if it's controversial.
So it sounds like whether you love her or hate her, she definitely makes people think.
There's no doubt about that.
It's been a wild ride so far.
Yeah, she covers a lot of ground in this book.
She does. Now, before we wrap things up, are there any other key points from the book that we haven't really touched on yet?
Well, there are a few things. She spends a good chunk of the book talking about Hollywood and, how those celebrities fit into the whole resistance narrative.
This is a pretty common theme among conservative commentators, isn't it?
Yeah.
This whole idea that, Hollywood liberals are totally out of touch with everyday Americans.
Oh, yeah, it definitely comes up a lot. And Coulter uses some pretty specific examples to make her point. She criticizes those celebrities for, using their platform to lecture people about politics, while at the same time they're living these, like, super lavish lifestyles.
So she's saying it's all just for show. Like, they're
Yeah.
not really sincere.
Right. She says they're more worried about looking good than actually doing good. And she thinks they're part of this, like, elite group that looks down on ordinary people.
And that they're trying to force their values on everyone else.
Exactly.
It's a view that definitely resonates with people who feel like Hollywood has become too politically correct. Like, you can't say anything anymore without offending someone.
Right. And that conservative viewpoints are being silenced.
Okay, so Hollywood hypocrisy. What else did she talk about?
Well, another big point that keeps coming up is immigration. It's always been a core issue for Coulter.
Right, she's been very vocal about illegal immigration for a long time.
Yeah, decades. And she doesn't hold back in this book. She basically says that it's this huge threat to America, to our sovereignty, to national security, to the economy, everything.
And she says that liberals are turning a blind eye to the problems because they're too focused on being compassionate or they want to win votes from Hispanic people.
Exactly. She thinks they're being emotional instead of logical.
And ignoring the real consequences of their policies.
Right. And she says the media is helping them do it.
By downplaying the negative stuff.
Exactly. And attacking anyone who speaks out against illegal immigration.
Which, again, all fits into her argument about media bias. That they're working against conservatives, trying to silence them.
It's a very contentious issue for sure. And it's been a central part of American politics for a long time now.
Yeah, for decades. And it's not going away anytime soon.
No, not at all.
Okay, so immigration is a big one for her. Anything else?
Oh, she also talks quite a bit about political correctness, how it's impacting our society.
That's another thread that runs throughout the book, right? That the left is trying to control what people can say and think.
Exactly. She says it's gone way too far, and now it's being used to, like, shut down anyone who disagrees with the liberal agenda.
So basically, you can't say anything that might be considered offensive.
Right. And she says that's creating this culture of fear where everyone's afraid to say what they really think.
Because they don't want to be labeled as, racist or sexist or homophobic or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And Coulter sees that as a huge problem for free speech.
Because it's shutting down debate, preventing people from having honest conversations.
Right. And she says people need to resist that trend.
To speak up, even if it makes people uncomfortable.
Exactly. Don't let yourselves be silenced.
That's a pretty powerful message for sure.
It is.
Well, I think we've done a pretty thorough job of unpacking resistance is futile. We've covered Coulter's main points, looked at her arguments, and talked about the reactions to the book.
Yeah, I think we've given our listeners a good overview.
It's been a really interesting and sometimes challenging journey into the mind of one of America's most outspoken and controversial political commentators.
No doubt about that.
Love her or hate her, she definitely makes you think.
She does. And she definitely knows how to get people talking.
That's for sure. And whether you agree with her or not, Resistance is Futile is a book that reflects some very real anxieties and divisions within our society.
It's a snapshot of a very specific moment in time.
And it forces us to confront some tough questions about our political system, our media, and our culture.
Exactly.
So as we always say on the Deep Dive, the best way to really understand a book is to read it for yourself.
Form your own opinions. Don't just take our word for it.
Right. Engage with the material, think critically, and have those conversations.
That's what it's all about.
And to all of our listeners out there, thanks for diving deep with us. Keep those minds curious and keep exploring those big ideas.